Helena watched the flames consume her small home with a mix of despair and resignation. The fire danced against the night sky, taking with it decades of memories. The intense heat dried the tears on her face before they could fully fall. At 65, she found herself once again without a place to call home. "Mom, come with me." The voice of Richard, her eldest son, was as authoritative as ever. "You'll live in my mansion. I can't let my mother be homeless. What would people say?" She hesitated. She knew that tone well, the same one Richard used in his TV interviews when discussing his business empire. It was a tone that brooked no argument. Helena looked one last time at the smoldering ruins of her home as firefighters worked to contain the last of the flames. "Let's go, Mom. The driver is waiting." The luxurious car seemed out of place in the modest neighborhood. Helena climbed into the back seat, clutching the only thing she had managed to save, a wooden box with some old photos and documents. Richard didn't even ask if she was okay, too busy with his cell phone. During the drive, Helena remembered the sacrifices she had made to raise her 3 children alone after her husband's death. Richard, the eldest, had always been determined and ambitious. Marion, the youngest, had inherited her father's sense of justice and became a lawyer. And Carl, the middle child, had chosen journalism, driven by the same restless curiosity he'd had since childhood. Richard's mansion loomed impressively behind wrought iron gates. The grand structure looked more like a palace, with its meticulously maintained gardens and illuminated fountains. Helena felt small in the face of such opulence. "Sandra!" Richard called as they entered. A middle-aged woman in an impeccable uniform appeared promptly. "Show my mother to the service quarters, and get her a uniform too." Helena felt as if she'd been slapped. "A uniform? Obviously, Mom, you don't expect to live here for free, do you? You need to make yourself useful, and also—" He looked her up and down with barely disguised disdain. "I can't have you walking around the house in those plain clothes. My guests are important people." "But Richard, I'm your mother. And that's exactly why you should set an example. Everyone here works. There's no room for unproductive people." He checked his gold watch. "I have a video conference in 5 minutes. Sandra, take care of everything." Helena followed Sandra in silence, climbing a narrow side staircase that led to the service area. The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the back of the property. Sandra left a uniform on the bed and quickly left, avoiding Helena's eyes. Alone, Helena opened her wooden box and took out a blank notebook she had saved for special occasions. On the first page, she wrote the date and began, "My son Richard has always been determined to conquer the world. Today, I realize that the world he conquered has no room for a mother who remembers his humble beginnings." The next morning, Helena woke to firm knocks on the door. Sandra entered hurriedly. "Mrs. Helena, the boss wants you to start today. You need to prepare breakfast for his guests." "But I don't even know the kitchen yet." "You'll learn like I did." Sandra hesitated for a moment. "And he asked me to tell you that you should only use the service stairs and not wander through the main areas of the house unless called." Helena put on the uniform with trembling hands. The rough fabric scratched her skin, but not as much as the wounded pride scratched her soul. As she descended to the kitchen, she thought of calling Marion and Carl, her other children. But what would she say? How could she explain that her firstborn, the one for whom she had sold the family land to pay for his education, now treated her like a servant? In the kitchen, Helena found other staff members watching her with curiosity and poorly concealed pity. She lifted her head and began to work. Years of cooking for her family had given her skill, but she had never imagined that one day her recipes would serve to feed strangers in her own son's house. As she prepared eggs and toast, she heard Richard's voice upstairs, laughing loudly with his guests. The sound of his laughter had changed, Helena noticed. It no longer had the spontaneity of his childhood. Now it sounded calculated, as if each laugh were measured to produce exactly the desired effect. "Are you really Richard's mother?" asked one of the younger cooks in a low voice. Helena nodded, focusing on not letting her tears fall into the frying pan. "But why then?" "Leave her alone," Sandra interrupted, giving the young woman a warning look. "We have work to do." That night, Helena wrote another page in her diary. Today I learned that there are different kinds of poverty. The material kind, which I faced for so many years raising my children, and the poverty of spirit which I now see consuming my firstborn. I don't know which hurts more. Carlos adjusted the focus of his laptop camera while waiting for the video call to connect. His sister Marian's worried face appeared on the screen, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, typical of someone who had spent the whole day in court. "Mari, you won't believe what I found out." Carlos ran a hand through his prematurely graying hair, a nervous habit he'd had since adolescence. "Remember the land Mom sold to pay for Richard's college? Of course, that piece of land Grandpa left her in the countryside. What about it? I found out there was a gold mine there. And that's not all." He picked up some notes. "Richard, can you?" He found out before the sale and never told anyone. Marian let out a surprised exclamation. "How did you find this out?" "I'm investigating a series of reports on suspicious American fortunes. Richard's name came up in some old documents. Mari, he used the money from the mine as seed capital for his entire empire." A heavy silence fell between the siblings. Marian was the one who broke it. "Carl, Mom is living in his mansion now after the fire." "What?" Carl almost spilled his coffee. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "It happened just a few days ago. I tried to talk to her, but Richard says she's adjusting and can't take calls yet." Carl felt a tightness in his chest. He knew his older brother well, his obsession with control and his shame about the family's humble origins. "Mari, we need to do something. Richard, he's not the boy we knew anymore." "I know." Marian bit her lip, thoughtful. "I have some contacts in the legal world who can help us, but we need to be careful. Richard has a lot of power now." Meanwhile, in the mansion, Helena was organizing Richard's private library. Each leather-bound book cost more than she had earned in a month when she worked as a seamstress to support her children. Her calloused hands gently brushed over titles in languages she didn't understand. "Mom?" Richard's voice startled her. "What are you doing here?" "Sandra asked me to clean the library. And why are you touching the books? They're rare, worth a fortune." He approached, his expensive cologne preceding his steps. "Actually, I need to have a serious talk with you." Helena felt her stomach sink. She knew that tone. "Tomorrow I'm hosting an important dinner. Several investors will be here, people who can triple the value of my companies." He adjusted his silk tie in the mirror. "If anyone asks, you're just another employee. I don't want you mentioning our relationship. You want me to deny being your mother?" Helena's voice came out firmer than she expected. "I want you to know your place." Richard looked at her coldly. "Or would you prefer to return to the ashes of your house?" That night, Helena wrote in her diary with trembling hands. "What is the price of a mother's dignity? Today I learned that to my son it's worth the same as his imported books. It shouldn't be touched by hands calloused from labor." In his apartment, Carl continued his investigation. Among old documents and records, he found something even more disturbing, evidence that Richard had manipulated their father's will. But he needed concrete proof. Marian, meanwhile, began to devise a legal strategy. As a human rights lawyer, she knew the ins and outs of the law. "If we can prove the fraud in the will and the story of the gold mine, we can not only recover what's rightfully Mom's, but also expose who Richard really is." In the mansion, during the dinner with investors, Helena served the dishes with the elegance she had always possessed, but that Richard refused to see. The guests treated her with the indifference reserved for the invisible, except for an elderly gentleman who watched her with unsettling attention. After dinner, as Helena collected the crystal glasses, the gentleman approached. "You have the same eyes as him," he said quietly. As Richard, Helena froze for a moment, but years of hard work had taught her to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm from that region, you know, where the Mendez land was." He smiled gently. "I always wondered how a recently graduated young man got the capital to start an empire so quickly. Now I'm beginning to understand." Before Helena could respond, Richard appeared beside them. "Mr. Rodriguez, I see you've met our new housekeeper." "Yes, a very familiar lady." Mr. Rodriguez maintained his enigmatic smile. You know, Richard, sometimes a man's greatest wealth isn't in what he owns, but in what he recognizes as truly his. Richard looked visibly uncomfortable. Come, I need to show you the projections for the new project. As the men walked away, Helena stored every word from Mr. Rodriguez in her memory. Later, she would add to her diary, Today I learned that there are people who can see through the masks we wear, and others who wear masks so heavy they've forgotten their own faces beneath them. The first time Helena cleaned Richard's private office was on a Sunday morning. He had traveled for an international conference, and Sandra gave her the task with visible discomfort. Be careful with the papers, Mrs. Helena. The boss is very meticulous with his documents. The office was a sanctuary of power, imported hardwood, furniture, paintings by famous artists, and behind the imposing desk a giant photograph of Richard shaking hands with the president. Helena noticed there were no family photos there, not even of his father. As she cleaned the shelves, a yellowed envelope fell from inside a book. Helena picked it up, her hands trembling as she recognized her late husband's handwriting. It was a letter addressed to Richard, dated a week before his death. My son, the doctor says my time is short, so I need to confess something. The land that will be your mother's inheritance hides a treasure greater than we imagined. I found signs of gold, but kept it secret to protect the family from exploiters. I want you as the eldest to help your mother manage this when I'm gone. I trust you to take care of her and your siblings. With love, your father. Helena sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of 2 decades of lies. Richard hadn't just known about the mine. He had betrayed his father's last wish. She tucked the letter into her apron, along with her diary. That night, she would write, Today I discovered that some betrayals are planted like seeds and take years to bear their bitter fruit. Meanwhile, in New York, Marion entered her office earlier than usual. On her desk, cases from various human rights issues awaited her attention, but her mind was focused on another matter. She had scheduled a lunch with Richard, the first attempt at reconciliation in months. The restaurant he chose was, predictably, one of the most expensive in the city. Richard was already there, checking emails on his latest model phone. Mari, long time no see. He stood for a superficial hug. Still defending lost causes? They're important causes, Richard. She sat down, studying her brother. How's Mum? Adjusting well. She always liked taking care of the house. Now at least she has a decent house to care for. He made a dismissive gesture. But tell me, what brings you here? Must be something important for you to leave your needy clients. Marion took a deep breath, controlling her irritation. I'm concerned about a lawsuit that could affect your companies. I've heard rumors in the legal world. Richard's interest was immediate. What kind of rumors? About certain past transactions, old documents resurfacing. She watched his reaction carefully. I can help, if you want. I have experience with complex cases. Richard studied her for a moment. I always knew you were the smartest after me. He smiled, the smile he used in negotiations. Maybe we can work together. My lawyers are competent, but blood is blood, right? In his apartment in Los Angeles, Carl received an important call. Mr. Carl, this is Anthony, a former employee of the mining company that bought the Mendes land. Yes, I remember you. I have something that might interest you. Documents from the time of the sale. Your brother. He knew everything from the start. There's proof. Carl felt his heart race. Where can we meet? At the mansion, Helena continued her work routine, but something had changed. The discovery of the letter brought a new light to her eyes, a quiet determination. During dinner, she watched Richard with his guests, the son who now seemed like a stranger. Mrs. Helena? It was Sandra with a worried expression. You dropped this. She discreetly handed over a folded paper, the letter from her husband. Helena froze. Sandra, don't worry, I know how to keep secrets. The housekeeper hesitated. I also have my own stories with the boss. Not all of them are pretty to tell. That night, Helena added to her diary. Sometimes we find allies in the most unlikely places, and sometimes it's precisely those who have also been hurt who help us heal our wounds. In her hotel room in New York, Marion made notes about her lunch with Richard. Her phone buzzed, a message from Carl. "I've got the proof. Richard manipulated everything from the start. But there's more. I found documents about Dad's will. He altered it, Mary. He altered everything." Marion felt a chill. The brother she had so admired in her youth was now revealing himself to be increasingly dark. Her response was brief. "We need to act. But first, we have to protect Mom." At the E.C. mansion, Richard returned from his trip. Passing through the kitchen, he saw his mother preparing dinner. For a moment, an old memory struck him. Her cooking in their humble home, humming as she made little seem like much. He shook his head, pushing the memory away. There was no room for sentimentality in his new world. Sandra watched Helena through the kitchen window as the older woman tended to the small herb garden she had started in the backyard. It was her only moment of peace during the day, when she could feel the soil between her fingers and remember the old yard of her home. The housekeeper had already noticed that something had changed in Helena since the discovery of the letter, as if a long dormant flame had been rekindled. "Mrs. Helena?" Sandra approached with a cup of tea. "You need to see this." It was an old, yellowed folder that Sandra had kept hidden in her room. "I found this a few years ago, when the boss had us clean out the old office. I never had the courage to show it to anyone, but after seeing that letter..." Helena opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were old documents, including a copy of her husband's original will, very different from the one Richard had presented after his father's death. There were also preliminary reports about the discovery of gold on the land, dated months before the sale. "Why did you keep this all this time, Sandra?" The housekeeper sighed. "Because I also have my own stories with Mr. Richard. He destroyed my family too. My brother worked in the first excavations on the land. When he discovered the gold, Richard convinced him to stay silent. Later, he fired him without references. My brother never found work in the field again." Helena felt a lump in her throat. "How many lives has my son destroyed in the name of his empire?" "Many, Mrs. Helena, many." That same afternoon, Marion arrived at the mansion for a meeting with Richard. Her heart ached to see her mother in a maid's uniform, but she maintained her composure. The plan depended on it. "Little sis," Richard greeted her in his office. "Did you bring the information you promised?" "Yes." She opened her folder. "But first, I need you to sign some documents. A power of attorney, so I can represent your legal interests." As Richard read the papers, Marion discreetly observed the room. Her trained lawyer's eyes catalogued every detail, every file, every folder that might contain relevant information. "Interesting choice of decor," she commented casually. "No family photos?" Richard looked up from the documents. "Business and sentimentality don't mix, Murray. I learned that early. Like you learned about the gold mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard slowly set down the papers, his eyes now cold as ice. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Mom's land, Dad's letter, the altered will." Richard stood up slowly, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "So that's it. You came here to confront me, to threaten me. I came to give you a chance to do the right thing, Richard. For Mom, for Dad's memory." He laughed, a sound devoid of joy. "The right thing? Look around you, Marion. All of this," he gestured to the luxurious room, "exists because I did what was necessary. While you and Carl were crying in the corners, I built an empire. On lies and betrayal, on determination and strength." He stepped closer to her. "And if you think you can threaten me, you're very mistaken. I have more power than you can. Imagine." In the garden, Helena continued her conversation with Sandra. The housekeeper revealed that other staff members also held secrets about Richard. The driver, who had witnessed suspicious meetings, the former cook who had been fired for hearing too much. Slowly, a network of silent allies was forming. "Mrs. Helena," Sandra hesitated, "there's one more thing. Your other children, they're planning something. I overheard Mr. Richard on the phone, very worried about an investigation." Helena smiled faintly. My children have always been united, except for Richard, who only trusted himself. At that moment, Carl arrived in Los Angeles with the evidence provided by the former mining company employee. In his hotel room, he organized documents and photos, piecing together the story of Richard's betrayal, one piece at a time. His phone rang. It was Marion. Carl, he knows. Richard realized we're investigating. That was predictable. Did you get anything from the meeting? Better. I recorded him admitting he knew about the mine before the sale. It's not definitive proof, but it's a start. Carl looked at the documents on his desk. Murray, this is going to be bigger than we imagined. It's not just about the mine or the will. Richard built an empire on lies, and every lie we uncover reveals 10 more. At the mansion, Helena wrote in her diary, "Today I understood that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover who we really are. Richard took my home, my dignity, tried to take away my identity as a mother. But every humiliation planted a seed of strength that's now beginning to sprout." Breakfast at the mansion always started at 6 sharp. That morning, however, Helena didn't show up in the kitchen at the usual time. Sandra found her still in her room, dressing with special care. "Mrs. Helena, is everything all right?" "Yes." "Sandra." Helena adjusted the simple necklace she had saved from the fire. "But today I won't be wearing the uniform." The housekeeper's eyes widened. "But the boss—" "My son," Helena corrected her gently, "needs to remember who I am." She descended to breakfast wearing a simple yet elegant outfit that Marion had discreetly left in her room days earlier. In the dining room, Richard was chatting with some executives when he saw her enter. "Mom, what is this?" He tried to grab her arm, but Helena pulled away with dignity. "Good morning, son." Her voice was calm but firm. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Helena Mendes, Richard's mother." The silence that followed was cutting. The executives exchanged awkward glances, while Richard visibly paled. "I imagine my son has never mentioned that his mother works as a maid in his own home." Helena poured herself some coffee. "Curious, isn't it? Especially considering that it was the sale of my family's land that started all this." "Mom, that's enough." Richard trembled with anger. "You're confused." "No, son. For the first time in a long time, I'm seeing everything clearly." She turned to the executives. "Gentlemen, have you ever heard of the Mendes gold mine?" Before Richard could intervene, one of the older executives spoke up. "The mine discovered, on that land in the countryside. It was one of Richard's first major investments." "Interesting." Helena smiled serenely. "Because when I sold that land to pay for his education, no one knew about the existence of that mine. No one except my son, apparently." The executives began to whisper among themselves. Richard, red with fury, quickly dismissed the meeting and dragged Helena to his office. "Have you gone mad? Do you want to destroy everything I've built?" "No, Richard. I want you to remember who you are, who we are." "We?" He laughed bitterly. "You're not part of this world, Mom. You never were. Look at your calloused hands, your simple ways. You don't belong here." "These calloused hands raised you, son." Helena kept her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. "These hands sewed your clothes when we couldn't afford. New ones. These hands signed away the only asset we had so you could study. And I turned that insignificant piece of land into an empire." "No, son. You turned a family's love into an empire of lies." Meanwhile, in Marion's office, she and Carl received another piece of the puzzle. A former employee of the notary's office, where their father's will had been registered, brought incriminating documents. "Look at this, Murray." Carl pointed to a signature. "Richard bribed the notary to alter the will. The original left the land divided equally among the 3 of us. That explains why he pressured Mom so much to sell." Marion typed furiously on her laptop. "With the sale, he gained total control over the mine's money." At the mansion, Helena was returning to her room when she encountered Sandra in the hallway. "Mrs. Helena, you were incredible," the housekeeper smiled. "I've never seen the boss so out of control." "This is just the beginning, Sandra." Helena took the letter from her husband out of her pocket. "I have more evidence stored away, and now I know I'm not alone." That afternoon, Richard called an emergency meeting with his lawyers. The buzz about Helena's revelations was already circulating in business circles. "I want her out of here today," he shouted at his legal team. "Sir," one of the lawyers cleared his throat, "technically, if there's proof of fraud regarding the mine—" "I don't care. Find a way." In her room, Helena wrote in her diary, "Today I took the first step to reclaim not just my dignity but the truth. Richard may have built marble walls around himself, but he forgot that it was my love that built his first foundations. And love, son, has the power to tear down even the highest walls." Marion received an urgent message from Sandra. "He's furious. I think he's going to try to kick your mother out. We need to act fast." "Tell Mom to resist," Marion replied. "Tomorrow I'll file the first lawsuit. Richard has no idea what's coming." The news of the lawsuit filed by Marion against Richard exploded like a bomb in business circles. The case, carefully crafted, not only questioned the ownership of the mine, but also exposed the will's manipulation and years of suspicious transactions. At breakfast the next morning, Richard found the table empty. Helena wasn't in the kitchen or her room. Instead, she was sitting in one of the main living room chairs, calmly reading the newspaper that featured the headline about the lawsuit. "You're behind this, aren't you?" He snatched the newspaper from her hands. "You conspired with your spoiled siblings to destroy me?" "No, Richard. You started your own destruction the day you decided that power was worth more than family." Helena stood calmly. "Your siblings just uncovered the truth you tried so hard to bury." "Truth?" He laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you never understood what it takes to win in this world. Carl with his little journalism gig and Marion defending lost causes. I built something real. Built on lies, son. And lies have short legs." At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was his main investor demanding explanations about the allegations. While he locked himself in his office to try to control the damage, Helena received an unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Helena." It was Mr. Rodriguez, the investor who had recognized her at dinner. "May we talk?" They sat in the garden, where Helena tended to her herbs. Mr. Rodriguez observed the well-kept beds with approval. "You know, Mrs. Helena, I've always admired people who know how to cultivate things, be it plants or relationships." He paused. "Your son never understood that. For him, everything was about extracting, never about cultivating. Did you know about the mine from the beginning?" "I suspected. But when I saw you here, treated as a servant, I was sure. Richard has always had a special talent for hiding his origins." He sighed. "Unfortunately for him, I also have a special talent, recognizing people who lie about who they are." In Marion's office, the legal team worked frantically. Carl had arrived from Los Angeles with more documents, including testimonies from former mining company employees. "Mary, look at this." Carl showed an old photo. "Richard visited the land 3 times before convincing Mum to sell. He already knew everything." "And there's more." Marion pointed to another document. "He used money from the sale to bribe inspectors. The gold was illegally extracted at first, before official permits." At the mansion, Sandra discreetly organized a meeting with other staff in the service quarters. Many had stories to tell, evidence to show. "The boss always treated us like trash," said the oldest gardener, "but Mrs. Helena, she treats us like people." "We need to help," agreed the cook. "I have copies of strange receipts he made me sign." Helena, in her room, received constant messages from her younger children. The plan was in motion. The press was beginning to sniff out the story, and Carl would ensure it was told correctly. Richard, desperate, tried to contain the leak of information. He called an emergency press conference, but every answer he gave seemed to raise more suspicions. His empire, built on secrets, was beginning to show cracks. "Mom," he burst into Helena's room that night, "I need you to deny everything. Say you're senile, confused." "No, son." She looked at him firmly. "I won't lie for you. I've lied to myself enough over the years, pretending not to see what you've become. You're going to ruin me. Is that what you want? To see your son destroyed? I want my son back, Richard. The boy who dreamed of doing good, who promised to take care of the family." She held his face in her hands. "Is he still in there somewhere?" For a moment, something seemed to waver in Richard's eyes, but soon the mask of coldness returned. "That boy was weak. I became strong." No, son, you became a prisoner. Of your lies, your fear of being exposed, your shame of your origins. That night, Helena wrote in her diary, "True power isn't in how much money we accumulate, but in how much love we're capable of giving. Richard accumulated millions but lost the ability to love. Today I see that my greatest failure as a mother wasn't being poor, but allowing my son to confuse value with price." The sun hadn't yet risen when Helena heard unusual activity in the mansion. Through her bedroom window, she saw several cars arriving, including some police vehicles. Sandra knocked on her door, breathless. "Mrs. Helena, the boss is being investigated. The federal police are here with search and seizure warrants." Helena dressed calmly. In her diary, she wrote a single line before descending, "Today is the day the truth stops whispering and starts shouting." In the main hall, Richard was gesticulating furiously with his lawyers as police officers searched every room of the mansion. Seeing Helena, he advanced toward her. "Happy, Mom? Is this what you wanted? To see your son humiliated?" "No, Richard. I wanted to see my son learn the difference between humility and humiliation." She kept her voice serene. "A lesson I tried to teach you long ago." Marion arrived shortly after, accompanied by other lawyers. Her face showed determination, but also sadness at seeing her brother in that situation. "The documents we found, Richard, aren't just about the mine or the will." She opened a folder. "They're years of fraud, of people harmed, of lives destroyed. You don't understand anything." Richard ran his hands through his impeccably combed hair, now disheveled. "You think building an empire is easy? That you make it by being nice?" "No," Carl interjected, having just arrived. "But you also don't build anything lasting on lies." The investigation lasted for hours. Every drawer opened, every file examined revealed new layers of Richard's empire. Sandra and other staff were called to give statements, confirming years of irregularities they had witnessed. In the garden, Helena found Mr. Rodriguez observing the commotion. "Did you know this would happen when you decided to confront your son?" "I knew something needed to happen," she replied, picking a sprig of rosemary. "Power without limits corrupts, Mr. Rodriguez, and my son lost all limits long ago." Inside the mansion, investigators found a secret safe in Richard's office. Besides incriminating documents, there was something that made Helena freeze. An old family album, which she thought had been lost in the fire. He saved the album. Carl carefully flipped through the yellowed pages. So there was still some feeling in him. There always was. Helena touched a photo of Richard as a child, smiling with his siblings. He just buried it so deep he forgot where he put it. By afternoon, reporters were crowding the mansion's gates. Carl, using his journalism contacts, ensured the story was told with accuracy and sensitivity. It wasn't just about corporate fraud. It was about family, betrayal, and redemption. Richard, isolated in his office, watched on TV as his empire crumbled, stocks plummeting, business partners distancing themselves, the reputation built over decades unraveling like a sandcastle. "Why, Mom?" he asked when Helena entered with a cup of tea. "Why couldn't you just leave things as they were?" "Because the price was too high, son. Not just for me, but for you, too." She sat beside him. "Every lie you told took you further from who you really are." "And who am I?" His voice broke, vulnerable for the first time in years. "My son. The boy who dreamed of making a difference in the world, who promised to take care of the family." She held his hand. "He's still in there, Richard. Buried under years of greed and fear, but still in there." At that moment, Marion entered with more documents. "Richard, we found records of secret accounts, embezzled money, bribe." "Enough!" He stood abruptly. "You've won, okay? You've destroyed everything I built." "No, Richard," Helena interrupted. "We're trying to save the only thing that truly matters, you." That night, when the activity subsided, Helena found her diary and wrote, "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what we should never have lost. Richard built an empire, but lost his soul in the process. Today, as I watched his world crumble, I saw a different glint in his eyes, perhaps the first sign of my son coming home." The next morning dawned with a different atmosphere in the mansion. The hallways, once filled with hurried staff, were silent. In the kitchen, Helena prepared breakfast as she always had in her old home, with care and simplicity. Sandra entered, hesitantly. "Mrs. Helena, most of the staff resigned after yesterday. They don't want to be associated with the scandal." "I know, Sandra, but you stayed." "I stayed because I learned something important from you. Dignity has no price." The housekeeper smiled, "and also because someone needs to help fix this family." In the office, now partially ransacked by the investigation, Richard remained seated, in his chair, staring fixedly at the family album found in the safe. Marion entered with a folder of documents. "I've negotiated with the prosecution," she said, sitting across from her brother. "If you cooperate, reveal all the schemes and return the embezzled money, we can minimize the legal consequences." "Minimize?" He laughed without humor. "Mari, look around, it's all over. The stocks have plummeted, investors have fled, my reputation—" "Your reputation was based on lies, Richard. Maybe it's time to build something real." In the living room, Carl organized a timeline of events with Sandra and other staff who had decided to stay. Each person had a story to tell, a piece of the puzzle revealing how Richard had built his empire. "He wasn't always like this," commented the oldest driver. "In the beginning, when he started having success, he still cared about people. But something changed after the mine started turning a profit." Helena, passing through the room at that moment, stopped to listen. "Power doesn't change people," she said softly. "It only reveals who they really are, or who they're afraid of being." In the garden, Mr. Rodriguez appeared again, this time with a surprising proposal. "Mrs. Helena, some investors and I have talked. We want to turn part of this scandal into something positive." He handed her an envelope. "It's a proposal to create a foundation using some of the recovered funds, a foundation focused on education and support for underprivileged families." Helena opened the envelope carefully. "Why are you showing this to me?" "Because we want you to chair this foundation. Who better to turn this story of greed into something meaningful?" Inside the mansion, Richard found his mother in her old room, still with the maid's uniform hanging in the closet. "Why did you keep this?" he asked, touching the rough fabric. "To never forget, son. Not the humiliation, but the strength I found in myself during that time." Richard sat on the simple bed, suddenly looking much older and more tired. "I really believed I was protecting you all, you know, keeping the family together through money, power, but you lost us in the process, son. You never lost me, did you? Even after everything I did." Helena sat beside him. "Mothers have a special talent, Richard. We can see through the masks our children wear, even when they can no longer see themselves." At that moment, Marion and Carl entered the room. There was tension in the air, but also something more, a possibility of a new beginning. "The investigators are done going through everything," said Carl. "They found more documents about the mine, about Dad's will." "I confess everything," Richard interrupted, his voice breaking. "Every fraud, every lie, I can't carry this weight anymore." Helena picked up the diary on her nightstand and began to read. "Today I understood that sometimes we need to lose everything we've built to find what we should never have lost. Our essence, our truth, our family." Richard cried for the first time in years, not out of anger or frustration, but genuine remorse. His siblings, after a moment of hesitation, sat beside him. "It's going to be a difficult road," said Marion, "but we'll face it together." "As a family," Carl added. Helena watched her 3 children together as she hadn't seen them in so long. In her diary, she would later write, "The true miracle wasn't exposing the lies or recovering what was lost. It was seeing my eldest son finally find the courage to be vulnerable, to admit his mistakes, to begin reconnecting with who he really is." 3 months passed since the revelations that shook Richard's empire. The mansion, once a symbol of power and ostentation, now breathed a different atmosphere. The gilded halls gave way to more welcoming spaces, and the office that had once been the scene of so many conspiracies now served as the temporary headquarters of the new foundation proposed by Mr. Rodriguez. Helena watched the transformation with a mix of pride and hope. She no longer wore a uniform, but kept the habit of waking early to tend to the garden, which had now expanded significantly. The small herb garden had transformed into a community garden where neighbors came to learn about organic farming. Mrs. Helena, Sandra approached with a cup of tea. Richard is asking to speak with you. He's in the old office. Entering the room, Helena found her eldest son organizing documents. He looked different, not just because of the absence of his expensive suits replaced by simpler clothes, but mostly because of the look in his eyes. The arrogance had given way to something deeper, more genuine. "Mom," he smiled timidly, "I've been reviewing some old company documents. I found something I think you should see." It was a yellowed folder containing social projects Richard had developed early in his career, before he got lost in unchecked ambition. Proposals for vocational schools, microcredit programs for small entrepreneurs, initiatives that had never left the drawing board. "I had forgotten about this," he admitted, running his hands over the papers. "I forgot that I once wanted to make a real difference, not just accumulate power." "It's never too late to reclaim our purest dreams, son." At that moment, Marion entered with news about the legal proceedings. "The negotiations are progressing. With Richard's cooperation and the return of the funds, we've reached an agreement that allows us to use part of the money for social projects." "And the foundation?" Helena asked. "The board unanimously approved your chairmanship, Mom." Marion smiled. "They said no one is better suited than you to turn a story of greed into a project of hope." Carl, who had come from Los Angeles for a series of reports on social transformation, joined them with his laptop. "You need to see this." He opened a video file. "These are testimonies from people who were harmed by the schemes of the past, but what's interesting is that many of them are willing to participate in the new projects, to give a second chance." Richard watched the testimonies in silence, silent tears streaming down his face. "How can they forgive after everything I did?" "Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, son," Helena replied, holding his hand. "It's about creating a different future." Sandra entered with a tray of coffee, accompanied by Mr. Rodriguez. The former investor had become a key ally in the restructuring. "The first donations for the foundation have started coming in," he announced. "People who were inspired by your story, Mrs. Helena, by your ability to turn pain into purpose." Helena picked up her diary, now almost complete, and read a passage aloud. "Sometimes our greatest strength isn't in standing tall during the storm, but in knowing how to plant flowers after it passes." Richard stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the garden. Down below, a group of people worked in the community garden, including some former staff members who had decided to return to help with the new projects. "You know, Mom," he said without turning around, "I spent years building walls to protect myself, to hide my origins, to keep people away. Now I understand that the true legacy isn't in the walls we build, but in the bridges." Marion and Carl exchanged emotional glances. It was the first time they had seen their older brother speak with such sincerity. "You always said that family is our most precious asset," Richard continued. "I twisted that, turned it into an obsession with material wealth. But now I understand. The real treasure was here all along, in the love that never ceased to exist, even when I didn't deserve it." Helena hugged her son, feeling in that embrace the weight of years of distance dissolving. In her diary, she would later write, "Today, I saw my eldest son reborn, not as the powerful businessman he worked so hard to be, but as the man he was always meant to be. And in that rebirth, our family also rebuilds itself, stronger because it's now founded not on secrets and power, but on truth and love." A year had passed since Helena confronted her eldest son in that mansion, which now served a very different purpose. The place that was once a symbol of power and ostentation had transformed into a vibrant community center, where the Mendes Foundation developed various social projects. That special morning, Helena prepared for the official inauguration of the new space. The main hall, once the stage for lavish parties, was now decorated with flowers from the community garden and handmade crafts produced by the participants of the social programs. "Mom?" Richard knocked gently on her door. He was no longer the same man from a year ago. The process of redemption had profoundly transformed him. "Are you ready?" Helena smiled, adjusting the simple necklace that carried so much meaning. "Almost. I just need to grab one thing." She opened the drawer and took out her diary, now completely filled. The pages contain not only the story of her struggle, but also the testimony of an extraordinary family transformation. In the hall, Marion was organizing the final details of the event with her usual efficiency. Her career as a lawyer had taken a new turn. She now coordinated the Foundation's legal department, helping people facing vulnerable situations. Carl, who had documented the entire family's journey, was finalizing the editing of a documentary on social transformation and redemption. His cameras captured the final moments of preparation, recording genuine smiles where there had once only been social masks. Sandra, who had chosen to stay at the mansion no longer as a housekeeper but as a project coordinator, supervised the arrival of the guests. "Mrs. Helena, you won't believe how many people came. There are even people from our old neighborhood." Mr. Rodriguez, now president of the Foundation's advisory board, approached Helena with a warm smile. "When we first met, Mrs. Helena, you were treated as a servant in your own son's house. Today you're an example of how dignity and love can transform realities." The inauguration ceremony began with an emotional speech from Richard. Standing in the same spot where he had once humiliated his mother, he now spoke with a humility few would have believed possible. "A year ago I considered myself a successful man because I had built an empire. Today I understand that true success isn't in what we build for ourselves, but in what we build for others." He paused, seeking his mother's gaze in the audience. "My mother taught me that in the hardest way, not with words but by example. She turned every humiliation into strength, every pain into purpose." Helena, seated between Marion and Carl, held her diary tightly. Those pages, which had once been her only refuge, would now serve as inspiration for others who needed to find strength in moments of adversity. "This foundation," Richard continued, "isn't just a way to make amends for past mistakes. It's a commitment to a different future, a future where success isn't measured by how much we accumulate, but by how many lives we transform." After the speeches, during the celebration, Helena walked through the mansion's halls, now decorated, with photos of the social projects and artworks from the program participants. Down below, a group of people worked in the community garden, including some former staff members who had decided to return to help with the new projects. "You know, Mom," he said without turning around, "I spent years building walls to protect myself, to hide my origins, to keep people away. Now I understand that the true legacy isn't in the walls we build, but in the bridges." Marion and Carl exchanged emotional glances. It was the first time they had seen their older brother speak with such sincerity. "You always said that family is our most precious asset," Richard continued. "I twisted that, turned it into an obsession with material wealth. But now I understand. The real treasure was here all along, in the love that never ceased to exist, even when I didn't deserve it." Helena hugged her son, feeling in that embrace the weight of years of distance dissolving. In her diary, she would later write, "Today, I saw my eldest son reborn, not as the powerful businessman he worked so hard to be, but as the man he was always meant to be. And in that rebirth, our family also rebuilds itself, stronger because it's now founded not on secrets and power, but on truth and love." A year had passed since Helena confronted her eldest son in that mansion, which now served a very different purpose. The place that was once a symbol of power and ostentation had transformed into a vibrant community center, where the Mendes Foundation developed various social projects. That special morning, Helena prepared for the official inauguration of the new space. The main hall, once the stage for lavish parties, was now decorated with flowers from the community garden and handmade crafts produced by the participants of the social programs. "Mom?" Richard knocked gently on her door. He was no longer the same man from a year ago. The process of redemption had profoundly transformed him. "Are you ready?" Helena smiled, adjusting the simple necklace that carried so much meaning. "Almost. I just need to grab one thing." She opened the drawer and took out her diary, now completely filled. The pages contained not only the story of her struggle, but also the testimony of an extraordinary family transformation. In the hall, Marion was organizing the final details of the event with her usual efficiency. Her career as a lawyer had taken a new turn. She now coordinated the foundation's legal department, helping people facing vulnerable situations. Carl, who had documented the entire family's journey, was finalizing the editing of a documentary on social transformation and redemption. His cameras captured the final moments of preparation, recording genuine smiles where there had once only been social masks. Sandra, who had chosen to stay at the mansion no longer as a housekeeper but as a project coordinator, supervised the arrival of the guests. "Mrs. Helena, you won't believe how many people came. There are even people from our old neighborhood." Mr. Rodriguez, now president of the foundation's advisory board, approached Helena with a warm smile. "When we first met, Mrs. Helena, you were treated as a servant in your own son's house. Today you're an example of how dignity and love can transform realities." The inauguration ceremony began with an emotional speech from Richard. Standing in the same spot where he had once humiliated his mother, he now spoke with a humility few would have believed possible. "A year ago I considered myself a successful man because I had built an empire. Today I understand that true success isn't in what we build for ourselves, but in what we build for others." He paused, seeking his mother's gaze in the audience. "My mother taught me that in the hardest way, not with words but by example. She turned every humiliation into strength, every pain into purpose." Helena, seated between Marion and Carl, held her diary tightly. Those pages, which had once been her only refuge, would now serve as inspiration for others who needed to find strength in moments of adversity. "This foundation," Richard continued, "isn't just a way to make amends for past mistakes. It's a commitment to a different future, a future where success isn't measured by how much we accumulate, but by how many lives we transform." After the speeches, during the celebration, Helena walked through the mansion's halls, now decorated, with photos of the social projects and artworks from the program participants.